Hey guys, thanks for coming back. Join us here at Salty Ginger Talk. Glad to have you back. So, in our episode today, we're going to talk about economics, and this will be the first of several, not necessarily in order, but first in several of episodes about economics, economic theory, some of the varying schools of thought, some history, some famous economists, and what they thought, and how they kind of went about proving their thoughts. I'm excited about this. My degrees in finance and economics, and I think getting a better understanding of economics is critical to help people think about how to process the world, make good decisions, and like right now, being in the throes of a very contentious presidential election in the United States, we hear a lot of talk about the economy and economics, and I think most people just hear those buzzwords and don't have really any idea what that means. I mean, in theory, at a very high, broad level, um, they understand it has to do with what they buy and business and those kind of things. We want to dive deeper into it, and so we'll do that in this and some upcoming episodes as well. So, that said, what is economics? Let's define it before we do anything else. Easiest way to do that is economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. So I had an economics professor who I thought explained it very succinctly and brilliantly. If you go back to our How to Persuade People episode, we talk about if you're not able to explain your idea to a 5-year-old in 30 seconds and make it make sense to them, you probably don't have a good sales pitch. You're probably going to go back and think of something different. But the way he explained it was if you're a great lawyer and you're a great typist, what would you do? And the answer is clearly be a lawyer and hire a typist because you only have so much time, resources, bandwidth to dedicate to your professional career. So you're going to maximize, you're going to make the choice that gives you the best possible chance for the highest level of success, which is an attorney. That's economics. You have scarce resources. You're making decisions on how you choose to allocate those. So economics, you apply that to take those resources and how do you put those resources to use in producing products or services, distributing products or services, and consuming products or services. And that's individually and collectively. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and get some basic definitions out of the way in this particular episode. So um, there's really two different versions of economics. One is micro, which you would think about like businesses, people, individuals, small groups, neighborhoods, and then macro, which is really like how does the country's economy operate and how does the country make choices on how to use their resources. Um, and then we'll talk a little bit about two of the major economic indicators that are used to judge the health and direction of an economy. One is GDP, which is gross domestic product, and one is the CPI, which is a consumer price index. They're two indicators that kind of give you a sense of how things are going generally in the broader economy. And those are very similar metrics that are used regardless of the country, used worldwide to kind of judge the health and trajectory of an economy. So, understanding at its core, human beings in general have unlimited wants, but limited means. So, a lot of times you have to decide whether you want to go out to a movie or you want to go out to dinner because you don't have the money to do both. Or you want to spend your time golfing instead of hiking because you don't have time to do both. Or, I think you get it. Those are choices. There's an opportunity cost to everything you choose to do because it means you're not able to do one or more other things. So you got to think about it from that perspective. What economists really want to understand what makes people make the financial and purchasing and consumption decisions that they make. What makes people pay $200 for a pair of Nikes when they could buy a pair of Skechers for $40 to cover their feet, get them where they need to be, provide support, do everything a pair of Nikes does for a fourth of the cost, right? A fifth of the cost, actually. Why do people do that? How does that work? How do they make those choices? And so economists analyze all of the variables that go into those decisions. And look, it's super complicated. You can have a better way to say it is you can have super complicated conversations about who does what and why they do it, but the basic principles remain the same no matter what. So, with that said, let's dig a little further into microeconomics. So, like we talked about, microeconomics study of individuals, businesses, small groups, small little slices of the country, of the world, and the decisions that they make on how they produce, consume, and distribute goods and services, and the resources that go behind those goods and services. Economists analyze how people respond to price changes. At what point does it become, we were hear about this a lot with fast food now, with the $20 minimum wage that was passed in California. There's been some growing noise around the cost of like a Big Mac value meal. I can tell you when I was a kid, you could pull up and you could buy a Happy Meal for 99 cents. You do a Big Mac value meal, which is a Big Mac, a large fry, and a large drink for $3. And, look, that was back in the 70s and 80s. Got it. The world's different now than it used to be. But what's the tipping point at which consumers will stop considering that a value and stop considering that that's a better way to allocate their food dollars than going to a grocery store and buying a hamburger and some French fries and making them at home? Because if you think about it, let's just say you pay, I don't know, I can't remember the last time. Let's say it's $15, and I don't know if I'm right or not. Let's say a big value meal is $15. I do know grocery prices, but you can buy a pound of ground beef for around $4, and you can buy a bag of frozen potatoes for around $3-4. So if you buy a quarter pounder with cheese value meal or a Big Mac value meal for $15, you eat once. If you take that same $15 and buy 2 pounds of ground beef and 2 bags of potatoes, using a quarter pound patty, you can eat 8 times for the same amount of money. Why do people choose that? Why do people choose to make those decisions? Is the convenience really worth that much? Uh, people's people, the way they react, the way they behave, says it is. But if you ask them and you question them on those, people will say one thing and do another. And that's what economists want to understand: is what drives that behavior? Why do they value those goods or services differently than other people do? That's what microeconomics is. How do people make their decisions every day? It's one of the things that both presidential candidates are trying to respond to. What are you going to do as president to make a more positive impact on an environment, an economy that has seen rampant inflation compounded over the last 4 years, and wage growth has not kept up with inflation. There's been wage growth, but not nearly at the rate at which prices on items have increased. So that's microeconomics in a nutshell. Macroeconomics studies the behavior and performance of the economy as a whole. And so that's countries, that's states, that's more macroeconomics. There's recurrent economic cycles that happen. It's hard to predict when they're going to happen, but the same cycle kind of happens over and over and over again. And how do you predict how those economic cycles are going to impact the broader economic growth and development of a country, of a state, of a larger entity? There's all sorts of factors that play into that you need to consider. Foreign trade. Most people will talk about how the income tax in the United States is necessary. Okay, well, the 16th Amendment, which created the income tax, was not passed until 1913. As we all know, the U.S. declared freedom from England in 1776, and then in 1789 instituted the Constitution after the Articles of Confederation had kind of been judged to be not acceptable, they weren't the best way to keep the country going forward. So, point being, from 1776 for over 100 years, what is that? Almost 150 years. There was no income tax. We had schools, we had roads, we had police, we had services, we had libraries. All those things existed without an income tax. But in macroeconomics, that's one of the things that economists are going to look at. What's the fiscal and monetary policy that government implements to try to manage their economy? How does it work? Well, what are the choices? And there are all sorts of factors that play into that you can use to determine if things are going in a good direction or not a good direction. Unemployment rates, inflation rates, interest rates, and GDP growth. And we'll talk a bit more about GDP in kind of the broad measure that it attempts to communicate to investors, to business people, to entrepreneurs, to people making economic decisions about how they're going to spend their dollars and take care of their family. And then it's very important in economics to understand the business cycle. In the business cycle, regardless of the business, there is always these 4 steps. They take different versions and take longer. There's four steps to it. Some steps last longer in some businesses than others, but there is expansion. There's a boom. So expansion is, okay, I started my business, things are going well. How do I grow it? How do I grow it? And then things take off. Boom, there's a boom, right? Then there's a recession. Things aren't going as well. It's hard to make your numbers, can't grow sales. Margins are getting compressed for a variety of reasons. So those are down. And that leads to depression. And that happens over and over and over again. It's happened for centuries. You can look at any business and that will hold true. And economists want to understand why. What drives those things? How do you predict those things? What are the factors that impact that business cycle in any particular sector? It's going to be different from sector to sector, right? You probably were sitting pretty if you made stagecoaches in the 1880s, but if you were in 1900s and made stagecoaches, that was a tough business to be in after Henry Ford revolutionized the auto industry with the assembly line and the Model T Ford. So that, depending on where you're at in history, a business can look really good or really bad, but you as a business person have to manage that cycle. So GDP, gross domestic product. What is GDP? Simply put, it is the total market value of all the finished goods or services in a period, typically a month, a quarter, a year. And those tend to get measured in the same time period, meaning what was GDP this month versus last month? What was GDP this month this year versus this month last year? What's the GDP for the trailing 12 months? How does that compare to the previous trailing 12 months? Those are comparisons that you need to make in order to understand how things are trending. Because if you just randomly pick a GDP number, how do you know how it compares to how things have gone? It doesn't make it good or bad. It's just a number without some type of context to understand how it relates to how things have been trending in the past, in the recent past, in the distant past. Recent past is more appropriate and more relevant than the distant past, but you can learn from how things worked in the distant past. Ray Dalio has several books and several talks on kind of the business cycle and the cycle of countries and economies, and super interesting. Ray Dalio, runs one of the largest private equity firms in the world. I think they've got over $1 trillion now under management. If not trillion, it's hundreds of billions. He's not inexperienced. He's not a dummy. And he spent a lot of time digging into that. So that's macroeconomics. And GDP is a lagging indicator, meaning it tells you how things went in the past month, past quarter. It's hard to predict what GDP is because you don't really know until all the goods and services have been sold out in the marketplace and all the receipts come in. So it's a lagging indicator. And then there's the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And that measures the level of retail price changes on a basket of goods. Now, you've got to be very careful when you look at CPI numbers because a lot of places will change the basket of goods. So if the Consumer Price Index went up 3%, okay, great. What does that mean? Was it the same basket of goods, or did they remove a particular good or service that really showed inflationary tendencies and replace it with a different good or service? Is it the same basket of goods or services that's being compared to a separate period? And it's how inflation is generally measured. Typically, gasoline and food prices get eliminated from most consumer price indexes. And if you look at a household budget, those are two pretty big line items in the budget that make up a high percentage of the spend of a household to be excluded from a consumer price index. So, good indicators, you want to make sure that there's consistency in the indicators, meaning the same basket of goods now as compared to the same basket of goods to whatever time period you're comparing to. And so yeah, you got to stay consistent. It's got to be apples to apples comparison. So hopefully the apples are in both, I think is the right way to say it. So um, yeah, so talking about some basic economic systems now, we'll just set the groundwork because we can dig into each of these in more detail in a future episodes. So there's basically five economic systems. Several of them don't exist anymore, and then there's fierce debate about the ones that do still exist and which one's best, and so on and so forth. So I have my own opinions. I'll share my own opinions when we get to it, but for now, let's just get them out on the table and define what they are, so that we're prepared as we move forward to all agree on this is what we mean when we say capitalism, or this is what we mean when we say socialism. So the first one is primitivism. And primitivism is caveman days, or I live out by myself in the woods or on a field or whatever. The individual produced all the goods that they needed. They grew their own food, they built their own houses, they got their own water, they took care of their own household necessities, they took care of it all. That was primitivism. It was a tough way to exist. You were on your own. If you didn't cut enough wood in the summer, you froze in the winter. If you didn't get your crops in the ground in time, you were hungry. A tough way to live, for sure. No real economies of scale. You're essentially trying to survive from one activity to another. Feudalism. So feudalism, Middle Ages, the land was owned by lords. So that's where landlord comes from, by the way. But the land was owned by lords, dukes, kings, viceroys, whoever. And then it was leased to the peasants that lived on it. So you lived on the land, you farmed the land, you made your living off of the land. So you took care of your family, and if you could eke out a profit by selling wheat because you could wheat to somebody else, great. But you paid a tax or rent to the landlord, and then in return, the landlord provided safety and security for their tenants, their peasants. So that's how landlord originated. So from that system of the economic system. And there's capitalism. Capitalism kind of sprung up. The first, I shouldn't say the first, but one of the more prominent early texts on capitalism was A Wealth of Nations, written by Adam Smith in the 1770s. And he talked very famously about the invisible hand. And the invisible hand is the market pushing resources, money, goods, services in specific ways, because that was what the folks in the economy, in the market, saw as the best allocation of scarce resources. I personally believe it's by far the best system. I don't really think it's debatable when you look at all of the evidence. Not perfect. It's got its issues. There are certain things, and we'll talk about it when we talk about capitalism, that are problematic. Monopolies are problematic in a capitalist society. Oligarchies are problematic in capitalist societies. You need laws to be applied fairly and evenly for capitalism to work, and you need the market to behave the same everywhere. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges is, let's say we decided to go full free market in the United States. Does that mean China would? Does that mean India would? Does that mean Brazil would? Does that mean Russia would? Venezuela? Not necessarily. They might not. So capitalism is not perfect, but for my estimation, it's by far the best system. And we'll talk about that more when we get into it. And I think the most important thing about capitalism is the invisible hand exists in capitalism, and the pricing mechanism is really strong in capitalism. Meaning, you as an entrepreneur or a business person, you have to understand your input costs in order to maximize your profit or to make a profit which keeps you in business. And that's one of the big blind spots, the main blind spot, in my opinion, in both socialism and communism, which are the next two that we're going to talk about. So, um, yeah, so that's capitalism. Supply and demand set the prices, and the market determines the best way to allocate those resources based on how society tells them, voting with their dollars, what do they buy, what do they not buy, in order to allocate those resources in the best way possible. Socialism. So it's a system where production is limited, or there's a hybrid ownership between the state and private owners. It's really more the state or the workers control the means of production. Now, the big problem here is, at least in my opinion, the big problem here is that prices, profits, and losses are not the determining factors on where resources get allocated. So you can do something because you feel good about it. You can do something because you feel right about it, and you can be flying the plane right at a mountain and not even know it, because nobody knows what the input costs are. Nobody knows if you're turning a profit, because nobody cares. And so that's problematic, in my opinion. Can't remember who wrote the book, but there's a book called I Pencil, and it's a great way to think about the big challenges with socialism, because in that book they break down how important it is when you think about making a pencil. You've got the wood for the pencil, you've got the paint for the pencil, you've got the metal that holds the eraser on, you've got the rubber for the eraser itself, you've got the graphite that goes in the pencil. You've got to produce all that. So you've got electricity costs, you've got taxes. If you don't know all of those costs, how can you know what it costs you to produce a pencil? And consequently, how can you know how much you should charge for your pencil in order to turn a profit? I Pencil is what it's called. So I highly recommend it. I cannot for the life of me remember the authors. I sit here right now, but it's a good book. The price mechanism is really well illustrated by that example, and that's, to me, the big problem with socialism. That and when you just think about the human spirit, people want to achieve. If they have an incentive to do better, they'll try to do better. If you take away that incentive, what's going to push people? What's their intrinsic reward for working harder, for burning the candle at both ends, for grinding, for whatever, for taking risk, however you want to think about it? If you don't have a reward, nobody's going to do that for the greater good. It'd be like everyone in my classroom. Let's say I'm taking a class, and everyone said, well, we know Joe's going to study, so we'll just let him study and cheat off of his test. Why am I going to do that? Why am I going to help everybody when I'm getting nothing from it? Is it just because I'm a great guy? Nope. It's not going to happen because I'm not that great of a guy. I can tell you that right now. So I think those are problems, and we'll talk more about those as we dig into each specific form, economic system. And then communism, and that's all activity runs through the state and is centrally planned. And the next socialist or communist economy that succeeds will be the first. I just think they're problematic because they don't have the pricing mechanism. The market is not allocating resources. Nobody is smart enough. No group of people is smart enough to clearly understand and see how those resources should be allocated. And they're going to make mistakes because what's good for one person is not necessarily good for other people. And that's why it's way better, in my opinion, to push the decisions back to a free market. Let the free market decide how to allocate time, capital, resources, labor, all of those things. It's really no brainer from my perspective when you dig into it. So that's kind of our primer on what is economics. Buzz through some basic definitions, buzz through some basic forms of economies. And in future episodes, we'll dig into all of those things deeper. I find it to be a fascinating subject. It's one of the reasons I got my degree in it. And that doesn't make me any better or worse than anyone else. It just means I've studied a lot about it. And maybe I'm an idiot. We'll see. You can agree or disagree with me, but that's a great thing about our country, in my opinion. You can agree or disagree, and we can be respectful of each other while we do it. So don't forget to go over to our website, guys, saltygingertalk.com. All of our podcast episodes are on there. Links to all of our other social media content is on there. You can sign up for our newsletter on there. And you can also leave us a comment or get in touch with us there if you want to talk about something. You got a request for an episode you want us to do. Happy to do it. We'd love to hear from you. So don't forget to head over there and check us out and get in contact with us. Thanks a lot, guys, for coming back. Great to have you here, and we'll see you next time. Have a great week.